What do you think about the idea? This is kind of tangential to what we're talking about, but the idea that like the myth of Jesus seems to kind of develop a bit more over time. Like when it's the myth, but like the story of Jesus. So, for example, Mark, which I'm sure you agree is our earliest gospel. You don't have the virgin birth. The original Mark, you don't have the disciples' encounter with the resurrected Jesus, and that's still written 30 years. 30 or 40 years after Jesus had died. So you've got like a good chunk of time for these myths to kind of, well, these ideas. So I won't use myths, but these ideas to kind of develop, and then you can clearly see it. And then Matthew, there's a little bit more like stuff going on, and by the time you get to John, it's like it's making like things like, and then they stabbed Jesus and blood gushed out. He was definitely dead. Like they're making, like, there are things in there that are like, that seem to be written in to solidify the stories more, or the myth is kind of, again, not myth, but the story is kind of growing. What do you make of that?
Now, to be honest with you, I don't see the story growing, and I'll tell you why. When it comes to the resurrection narratives, before any of the Gospels are written, you've got Paul. And Paul talks about the resurrection of Jesus and his appearance to others in individual and in group settings. Paul is definitely talking about a physical bodily resurrection. I can unpack that if you like at some point. But so what he says about the resurrection is completely in concert with what the Gospels report. Mark doesn't have any of the appearances, but Mark predicts them. In chapter 14, verse 28, you have Jesus saying that he's predicting his resurrection, and he says, "After I rise, I will go ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see me." And so when the angel is talking to the women at the empty tomb, he says, "Go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of them to Galilee. There they will see him, just as he told them." So Mark knows of this appearance, and the Gospel of Mark does end abruptly at chapter 16, verse 8. And so you have scholars saying, well, did Mark intend to end it there, or was that not his intent? And then those who say it was not his intent, which is a significant minority of very good scholars, and they'll say, well, either Mark was unable to complete it for some reason. Maybe he died. Maybe he got sick and somehow was unable to, or the ending was lost. I don't know which one. But I do think that Mark. I am of the opinion that Mark did not intend to end his gospel there, because I think it'd be really weird for him to have done so. Now, those who think that Mark intended to end his gospel there, if you got 10 theologians or scholars who comment on it, you've got 15 different reasons that they give why he may have done. So there is no majority opinion on why Mark would have ended in such an awkward manner there. So, and in terms of the spear and blood and water came out, that John may have included that for theological significance, but you have Quintilian, who wrote in the first century, and he says the executioner was allowed to pierce the crucified. So percussus in the Latin, he was allowed to pierce the crucified. So especially if they were trying to expedite death, and it was the Passover. And so I think the story about Pilate ensuring that they would die the same day is entirely plausible, especially because it was a holiday, the major holiday. And even Josephus, later on in his Jewish War, Book 4, Section 317, he's talking about when the Idumean Jews came into Jerusalem around the years 67 or 68, and they killed a bunch of the Jews, and they would not allow them to be buried. And Josephus said the Jews in Jerusalem were incensed at this, because it had been the custom of the Jews to remove the crucified and give them a proper burial prior to sunset. So you would expedite to death by breaking the legs. If they saw that Jesus was already dead, as the Gospels report, then piercing him in the side would have been something that would make perfect sense. People have said, well, what's blood and water from? And some have said, like from the American Medical Association, it's probably the pericardium. the sac around the heart that would have some fluid in it. But I've talked to an emergency room physician, and he said, nah, you'd only get maybe a tablespoon of fluid out if that happened. He thinks that probably in the beating that Jesus would have taken from the Jewish and Roman soldiers, that he would have probably been punched hard in the chest. It would have caused his lungs to swell, and that's where the water came from. He said that makes more sense to him. So I'm not a physician. I can't comment on that, but I don't think just because it has some theological significance that in that sense you would discount it as a historical detail. Oh, one more thing. When we come to Mark and we read it through the lens of ancient biography, the picture of Jesus we have, of Jesus being God's uniquely divine son, deity, is every bit as strong as we have in John's gospel. And John's Christology is every bit as strong as we find in Paul, who wrote before any of the Gospels. So you've got Paul at one end, John at the other as bookends. You've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke in between, Mark being the earliest Gospel. And I think his Christology is every bit as high as what you find in Matthew and in John.